Welcome to part two. In part two, we are going to be looking at a cross-section view of the spinal cord. You will identify where the gray matter is and what a nuclei is. You will also identify the function of the anterior and posterior roots. So, where we left off, that the spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata to about L2 at the conus medullaris. So the conus medullaris is right there. And we have the cauda equina dangling down. We have our cervical and our lumbar enlargements, and then we have our thoracic region. And we have spinal nerves coming off at regular intervals, going from C1 to eventually coccygeal 1. So we're going to take a cross section. We're basically going to take a little snippet right about there, and we are going to look at the cross section. So the spine is an oval with a little tiny sulcus right there and a large fissure right there. So the spine is oval in shape. Now, there is a giant gap right there, and we have a little tiny thing right there. So this is basically the cross section. Now, what was a little tiny indentation called? Correct, it is a sulcus. And since it's in the middle, what would we call it? Correct, median. And the little secret that I didn't tell you was this is the posterior side, so it's the posterior median sulcus. Do you remember what a bigger groove is called? It's a fissure. And since this is the posterior median sulcus, what would you call the fissure on the anterior surface? Correct, anterior median fissure. So the spinal cord is a flattened oval. It has a posterior median sulcus on the back, anterior median fissure on the front, and you can always use that to orient an anterior versus posterior. So, do you remember what a nerve is? Is a nerve axons or is it dendrites? That's right, nerves are axons. So, the axons are going to be going in and out of the spinal cord to make up the nerve. So remember my example, you hurt yourself, you have the tack. There's your tack, and you step on it with your foot. So a signal is going to go on an afferent axon into the spinal cord. And since this is a sensory neuron, it is a unipolar neuron. And it's going to go into the back right there. Now motor signals are going to come out of the front side. So there would be an efferent or motor signal. And do you remember what kind of motor neurons are? That's right, they're multipolar. Oops. That's right, they're multipolar. So you have all these little dendrites here, and there's the efferent. So which side are the axons leaving on? They're leaving on the anterior and the posterior surface. So, to summarize, we have a little itty-bitty sulcus back here on the posterior side in the middle, posterior median sulcus. A big, giant fissure on the front or anterior median fissure. And afferent neurons are going to come in the back, or the axons of afferent neurons are going to come in the back. Remember, their cell body is pushed to one side, and they enter on the posterior surface. Now, motor neurons, being a multipolar neuron right there, they're going to actually go and leave on the anterior surface and go together. So, axons enter and leave on the posterior lateral and anterior lateral surfaces. So this is posterior lateral, this is anterior. And they leave in these little tiny structures called rootlets. So that would be one rootlet. So each one of these lines is a rootlet. So there's going to be lots of rootlets here. And the rootlets all come together and they make roots. So this would be the posterior root, and this would be the anterior root. So how do I know this is the anterior root other than it's labeled somewhere on here and this is posterior? Well, we have our posterior median sulcus here, anterior median fissure, and we're going to have this ganglia too, which I'll talk about on another slide. So here's our spinal cord, posterior and anterior sides. Afferent goes in the back on the posterior root, efferent comes on the front on the anterior root. And notice where I stopped it right there. That's because it goes to gray matter. And the gray matter is in the form of horns. So there's a little devil horn here and a little devil horn here. What would you call those horns on the back? Well, posterior median sulcus, posterior root, it must be the posterior horn. Now see the swelling right here? Well, that's on the anterior. If this is the posterior horn, it must be the anterior horn. So let's draw the other one over here. So that would be anterior. Now I drew this at L1 intentionally because L1 has a bonus horn on the lateral side. That's posterior, that's anterior. What would you call a horn right here on the anterior side? That's right, it is the anterior horn. That is the lateral horn. So, the spinal cord is horny. We have this commissary in the middle. We then have a long posterior horn on either side, a big anterior horn. Then some of it is going to have a lateral horn right here. So, the spinal cord is horny. It's full of horns. It has a big, long horn going back, correct, posterior. Another horn going to the front, yep, anterior. Then some sections will have a knob going lateral, so that would be the lateral horn. So posterior, lateral, and anterior. And sometimes you see dorsal and ventral for those. So, back over here, we have our afferent neuron coming in. There's its cell body. It is going into the posterior horn. We have our motor neurons coming out. A lot of them, the somatic motors, are coming from the anterior horn. Some of them are going to be coming from there, which is the lateral horn. So the posterior horn is where sensory neurons go. Motor neurons originate in the lateral and the anterior horn. Now, the gray matter is an H shape or a butterfly shaped, and there is a commissary tract in the middle of it right here. That commissary tract is called the gray commissary because it's gray matter and it's going from left to right, and commissary tracts go from left to right. Now in the middle of it is the central canal. This allows cerebral spinal fluid to flow down the spine. I have read that it starts to close off as we become adults. So, like I said, there are 2 or 3 horns. We have our anterior horn here, lateral horn here, and posterior horn here. What happens is sensory signals, so afferent signals, are going to come in, and there is our cell body, and they're going to go to nuclei in the posterior horn. Remember, nuclei is gray matter surrounded by white matter. So these are sensory nuclei. So the cell bodies of the afferent neurons are in these ganglia, and the axons go to a nuclei that's a sensory nuclei. These sensory nuclei could be part of a reflex that tells the motor neurons in the anterior horn on the other side to do something, or it could go to a white matter projection tract and go up to the brain. So it could do one of those 2 things. The anterior horns are in the front. So this is the anterior horn, and this is motor neuron cell bodies. Now these are somatic motor, which is voluntary. So those are going out the anterior root, and they are going to go to skeletal muscle. Now, some of it has lateral horns. T1 through L2 have these lateral horns. That is part of the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic sort of looks like automatic. Think of automatic things like you get scared, automatically you get goosebumps and your pupils dilate. Or you get hot, automatically you start to sweat. So these deal with things like that. So they go to smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, and glands, where the anterior goes to skeletal muscles. So we have white matter in 3 parts of the spine. And it's very fun to draw because my board is already white. This is the white matter in the back. Let's see, posterior horn, posterior root. Let's call it posterior white matter. Now, if you remember, I said afferent signals go into the posterior horn, where they meet integration neurons that can either send a signal to a motor neuron in the anterior horn, or they can go and they can take signals into the white matter, and these are myelinated axons going up to the spine. So that would be a projection track. Likewise, we have white matter on the anterior side. Well, if that's posterior white matter, this side must be anterior white matter. And the anterior white matter generally has projection tracks coming down from the brain. And yep, you guessed it, those neurons are going to go to the anterior or to the lateral horns and send signals out on motor pathways. So what do you think we call this white matter on the side? Yep, this is the lateral white matter. I will draw that over here. So there's our glitter pen, lateral white matter. So posterior white matter generally is coming from the posterior horn. So there's sensory tracks. Anterior white matter is generally signals going to the anterior and lateral horns. So they generally are motor tracks. And the lateral is special. So the white matter surrounds the gray matter, or the gray matter is deep to the white matter. And it's made up of projection tracks. The posterior projection tracks are generally sensory. The anterior projection tracks are generally motor. So if we look at this, this is divided. These are showing the sensory tracks, these are showing the motor tracks. So our motor tracks tend to be in the anterior white matter and the deep lateral. Our sensory tracks tend to be posterior here, except for this bad boy. That's my favorite track. It's the spinal thalamic tract, and that is anterior lateral. So again, white matter surrounds gray matter. They're made up of projection tracks. And in the back, the projection tracks going to the spine, so they're afferent. In the front, they're projection tracks coming from the brain, so they are efferent. And on the side here, we actually have a mixture of both. Now, lastly, there's actually a commissary tract right there. Well, if this is the gray commissary, that must be the white commissary. So this is the gray commissary, that is the white commissary. So two more commissary tracks. And again, commissary tracks just bridge the left side to the right side. So I'm going to keep this very simple for you. We're only going to worry about the posterior and anterior. So see, only worry about the first two for the test. The posterior are all afferent, and the anterior are all efferent. And that makes perfect sense because you are going to have afferent neurons coming in to the back, junctioning right there, and you're going to have efferent neurons coming down the anterior surface of the spinal cord. We're going to just draw one there, and bridging into motor neurons leaving the anterior root. Now, we do have the special ones. The superficial lateral ones tend to be afferent. The deep lateral ones tend to be efferent. And then we have my favorite, the evil spinal thalamic tract, which is an anterior deep sensory tract. So let's check for understanding. Where are your motor tracks? Anterior or posterior? Well, according to this, motor signals are going out the front, so the motor tracks must be in the anterior white matter. So it is anterior. Where are cell bodies of integration neurons? Well, let's look at our picture. Our afferent neuron is coming in. There's its cell body. Oh, it is in the posterior horn. So it is in the posterior horn right there. Okay, last question. Where are the cell bodies of afferent neurons? So those are the neurons going in. So here's your spinal cord. And the choices are, I don't know, haven't talked about yet, something about ganglia and den catabieno. That sounds like Greek to me. Well, we are at 15 minutes, so we'll have to discuss that in our next video.